The story starts with a man and a woman wearing kimonos and silently walking by a river. Eventually, they crossed a bridge and kept walking until they reached a specific point in the waterway. At that moment, the man pointed out the river's rapids and said that that river was a real man-eating one. The woman then got closer to him to the point of touching his shoulder with her head and, after calling him sensei, told him it was time for them to go together, to which he agreed. Right after, they both tied their hands together using a red cord, and he declared, after calling her Seiken, that they would be together forever from that moment onwards. However, before they could do or say anything else, a truck appeared and hit them both. Wow, there wasn't even a road there. Truck-kun really takes his work seriously. Anyway, I digress. On that day, a certain great author and his lover left that world. Our protagonist woke up in what seemed to be a church, and he concluded that that was the world people went to after they died. In fact, he even highlighted that it was a Western-styled place. At that moment, a woman who looked like an elf priestess appeared and told him that that was not the world after death. She then welcomed him and introduced herself as the guide of those who descended upon that world. Her name was Annette. She also explained to him that he was in a different world from the one he had come from. They both walked towards a window, and he could see a dragon flying outside while she told him that he had been chosen and transported there, to that land enclosed in darkness which was called Zauberberg. Annette then indicated that his mission was for him to become a hero who brought light to that world. However, his reaction was unusual. Instead of panicking or getting excited, he kept his undaunted demeanor and just wanted to double-check if, after failing to kill his lover and himself, he had been taken to that strange world. After Annette confirmed it, he only said his life had been shameful. The priestess then was about to tell him the details of his mission, but before she could say anything, he took several sedative pills in another attempt to take his life, which panicked the woman. However, the priestess thought fast and used purifying magic to save him. Almost immediately, he woke up, and without losing his composure, he told her that she didn't need to do that. In fact, he added that she was bothering him and asked her to stop. Nevertheless, the woman didn't listen to him. She reprimanded him and reaffirmed that he would become a hero who would fulfill his great mission of saving that world. Unfortunately for her, he replied that he didn't care about that and added that he was just looking for a place to die. He then began to take more pills, which panicked the priestess again. The woman then asked him why he was doing that after being chosen by that world. He laughed at her and told her he hadn't asked to be chosen, but the priestess asked him back if he hadn't been visited by a truck, which he confirmed. She then explained that the truck was the Other World Selection Truck. Wow, Truck-kun is canon in this story. Among the many people in our protagonist's old world who lived unhappy lives, only those struck by that truck got to redo their lives in that world. That was the service they provided. By the way, while she tried to sell him how marvelous had been the opportunity given to him, he kept taking sedative pills as if they were candy. Nevertheless, once the priestess finished, he got close to her, grabbed her staff, and told her that the truck had interfered with what was meant to be the happiest moment of his life. He then asked her who they were to decide if someone was unhappy or not. He then began to smoke. As for the priestess, she couldn't believe his attitude. She thought that he had been saved from an unhappy life, yet he was acting that way. Right after, she showed him his stats in an attempt to cheer him up. After all, without exception, every human taken to that world was granted the ability to wield superhuman powers. Sadly, his stats were almost zero. He was so weak that even after being detoxified, he was still showing the poison status. She then began to panic and quickly searched through all his status windows only to confirm he was extremely weak. He then tried to leave, but she grabbed his hand and apologized since it seemed that he had indeed been taken to that world by mistake. In fact, he was not fit to live in that world. However, he simply smiled at her and replied that that had been the story of his life. She then offered him to stay at the church for a while because he was too weak to survive outside. but he rejected her and decided to leave. At that moment, she finally realized he was indeed a different man. Up to that moment, she had closed her heart to the chosen ones because their attitude was awful. In short, they were all douchebags, so she simply flattered them again and again. Nevertheless, that time was different. He had indeed touched her. She then tried to stop him by asking him to at least choose a profession before leaving, and he replied that he already had one, writer. Afterward, she complimented her ears and left. What he didn't know was that with his actions he had confirmed to her that he was the man she had been waiting to arrive. Some time later, he was walking on a prairie while eating his candy when a voice in his head told him that he had gained 5 experience points for discovering the Great Plains of Erston, and of course that annoyed him since he suffered from migraines. Sadly, the system didn't care about it and informed him that he had leveled up, so he was level 2 at that moment. Right after, he heard the scream of a cat woman and found that she had been attacked by a death tree. She then recognized him as an adventurer and asked him for his help. He looked at her and realized that had been meeting people with oddly shaped ears that day. He also thought that dying women were certainly beautiful. He then asked her if he could write a novel based on her. That pissed the woman off and she urged him to save her. He then tried to reach her, but she was being held too high, which led to a very awkward moment. She then asked him if he had a sword or some spells or something. Immediately thereafter, the tree caught him by the neck and he found it funny being asphyxiated, which in turn exasperated the woman. She even called him useless, disgusting bastard. On the other hand, he was enjoying that moment since he was finally dying. Those trees had the suction skill that allowed them to steal life force from their captives. Unfortunately for everybody, except the woman of course, by sucking our protagonist's life force the tree got poisoned and died before it could kill its captives. Our protagonist then lamented having survived, and the system informed him he had inflicted 300 points of damage due to his poison, rising 1 level. He was level 3 at that moment. As for the Catwoman, she couldn't believe how he had killed the tree. She even said he had been just pretending to be weak to trick the monster, to which he replied that he was just a man who had wished for death and yet he had survived. In fact, he had tried 5 times to no avail up to that moment. She then tried to cheer him up by inviting him to her place as a way to thank him for saving her life. However, when she took his hand, he looked at the red cord and finally thought of Sakin. He then wondered if she had also gone to that world. He walked away while ignoring the Catwoman's attempts to tell him her name. He was too busy thinking that he had just found a reason to live in that whimsical other world. He would find Sakin so they could finally die together. Meanwhile, at the church, the priestess was praying to the gods of that world so they protected that adventurer and allowed them to meet again someday. At that moment, our protagonist opened the door of the church, which made the priestess very happy. Nevertheless, when she was running to hug him, the Catwoman appeared behind him asking why they had gone to that place. The priestess froze after seeing the Catwoman since she didn't know who she was. But before she could say anything, our protagonist, who liked to be called Sensei, told her he had a question for her. Right after, he said he was looking for a woman named Sakin and asked her if she had any idea of where she might be. That question shocked the priestess because it implied the existence of another woman in his life. Sadly, the priestess knew nothing, and he left the church with the Catwoman thinking he didn't have any leads to find Sakin. The Catwoman then tried to cheer him up and told him that since they've still got a way to go to her place, they should stop by the castle town of Roth. She then tried to grab his hand, but the priestess suddenly appeared and hit her with her staff. She then reprimanded the Catwoman for being shameless by holding a man's hand in public. The Catwoman then asked her why she had decided to go with them, before teasing her saying that she was in love with Sensei. That startled the priestess, who tried to justify her actions, saying that as a clergy person, she had a responsibility to protect that weak otherworlder. The Catwoman was surprised by knowing he was from another world, but quickly clarified that he was strong because he had insta killed a death tree to save her. The priestess couldn't believe that he had gotten that close to another woman and panicked. After all, saving someone's life was a big deal. As for the sensei, he had finally found a nice place to take a nap, a coffin that someone had left in a pile of garbage. He then asked the women to wake him up when they arrived at their destination, and the priestess immediately took a rope to pull the coffin there. Meanwhile, in a castle, a pink-haired lady looked at the lake in front of her while keeping a sad expression. The priestess and the Catwoman were making a huge effort to pull the coffin, with our protagonist inside, by using 2 ropes. You could see they were very tired because it was too heavy. In fact, the Catwoman couldn't take any more and yelled at the sensei since he could walk on his own 2 legs. However, there was no response and the Catwoman even suspected he might be dead, but the priestess quickly checked his status window and confirmed he was okay. She then suggested to keep going since they were already near the castle. By the way, due to our protagonist having called the Catwoman Tama, Annette kept doing the same despite knowing it wasn't her name because she wanted to tease her. As for the sensei, he was thinking of Sakin and swore to himself he would find her so they could kill themselves together. Sometime later, they arrived at their destination, the castle town of Roth, and Tama opened the coffin while waking our protagonist up. He quickly left the coffin and after seeing everything around couldn't help but be convinced that he was indeed in another world. Wow, the people of that town are really tough. They saw a person waking up from a coffin in the middle of a crowded street and they barely reacted. Right after, Annette suggested going to the castle and having an audience with the king. Afterward, they met with the king who kindly welcomed them. He introduced himself as Thomas and his daughter, Princess Charlotte, did the same. He then offered them to rest that night in the castle's bedchambers, which was very well received by the women. Although the king agreed to that on one condition, he wanted to hear travelers' stories because he loved them very much. After hearing that, the sensei smiled and asked if he could tell them how it felt to sleep in a coffin. Of course, that startled the king, who even thought our protagonist might be threatening him. Luckily, Annette quickly stepped in and complimented the princess' beauty. That lightened the mood, and the king happily told her that her daughter was going to get married soon. He even asked them for advice regarding that matter. Immediately thereafter, he introduced Gomez, the valiant warrior, and Otto, the wandering minstrel of love, to the travelers. The king then explained that perhaps due to the influence of the wrathful Dark Lord, monster activity had increased in recent times. Nevertheless, he had grown too old to deal with that problem. So he had decided that one of those 2 would become Charlotte's husband and the next king. The problem was that Charlotte hadn't chosen a candidate yet, so he asked the travelers who was the more suitable husband for Charlotte. The sensei then stopped eating his candy and with a solemn demeanor replied that he had no idea, which startled the king. However, our protagonist didn't stop there. He said that Charlotte's future hinged on that critical choice, so the king shouldn't be taking advice on that matter from travelers who had just arrived that day. He also said that the king was horrible and a tyrant. Heck, he even added that Thomas was not fit to be a king. Well, at least he admitted that since he was not fit to live in that world, he had no right to say that. The sensei left after that, and both the priestess and the Catwoman began to apologize to the king for his behavior. They said that since he was an otherworlder, he might be a bit rash. Luckily, the otherworlder thing was enough to appease the king. By the way, while they were talking, the princess couldn't help but stare at our protagonist until he left the throne room. That night, our protagonist was in one of the rooms looking at the moon through a window, when the priestess woke up and asked him if he was having trouble sleeping. They were sleeping in separate beds, in case you wondered. He turned his head to look at her in the eye and replied that he never slept well. Those words hit her hard, and after a pause, she finally asked him who was Sakin. Unfortunately, before he could answer, the priestess noticed that Tama was sleeping under our protagonist's blankets. The Catwoman was even resting her head on his thighs. That was too much for Annette, who hit the other with a pillow and began reprimanding her. Both women kept fighting for a while, and the sensei took advantage of the chaos to leave the room unnoticed. He then began to wander through the corridors of the castle and eventually met Charlotte, who was looking at the lake with the same sad expression as before. He got closer to her and told her it was a nice view. She agreed, and they both began to contemplate the lake and the moon's reflection on its surface. However, he quickly killed the mood by saying that it made him want to drown himself. Obviously, that startled the princess, who asked him if he was so troubled that he wished to kill himself. But he only scoffed at her and replied that it seemed to him that she was more troubled than him. She went silent, but after a while, he said that she still couldn't choose between Mr. Gomez and Otto. On the one hand, Mr. Gomez was already the most dependable of their soldiers, and the king had faith in his strength as well. For that reason, she should probably choose him. On the other hand, Otto was her childhood friend. Whenever she felt down, he wrote songs and went to sing them to her. In the end, she didn't know what to do. He then laughed a little and said that, unlike him, she was a truly kind girl who cared for her father. He also added that his life had been a continuous series of troubles. In fact, he had attempted to kill himself and die with someone else numerous times, which inconvenienced his father and family greatly. However, he made clear that he had never once asked anyone else to choose how he should live for him. In the end, she should decide for herself what she would do, and for that, she should ask herself what she truly wanted. He left after saying that, but those words resonated deeply with the princess. The next day, the king summoned the travelers again to the throne room, where he was along with the princess, Otto, and Mr. Gomez. The reason was that Charlotte had finally chosen who she would marry, so he wanted the travelers to act as witnesses. Annette and Tama placed their bets and argued a little since they were supporting different candidates. And right after the king asked Charlotte to stand before the man she had chosen and spoke her vows. She then went towards our protagonist, took his hand, and declared that she wanted to die together with him. Of course, that astonished everybody. Heck, even the priestess passed out after declaring there was no god. Charlotte then explained that after talking to the sensei, she had realized that she didn't want to marry any of the candidates because they both had things that annoyed her. Obviously, the king couldn't accept that and tried to force her to choose a husband. In fact, he took her decision worse than the candidates themselves. The princess then reprimanded his father because he wanted her to get married without asking her opinion. In the end, nobody had considered her feelings, except for our protagonist. Nevertheless, before they could keep talking, Mr. Gomez removed his armor and revealed himself as a minotaur, a servant of the wrathful Dark Lord. He then confessed he had intended to acquire that kingdom by becoming its king and then offering it to the Dark Lord. The worst part for the Minotaur was that he had blown out his cover due to a misunderstanding. He had thought the princess had seen through his disguise, but she simply didn't like him. Sadly, he couldn't back down at that point, so he decided to kill everybody. Some soldiers arrived after hearing the commotion, but the Minotaur easily defeated them. Right after, Tama stopped trying to wake up the priestess and faced the Minotaur. After all, she was a level 14 martial artist. Otto, as a level 89 wandering minstrel, began to sing a song with his harp, and Tama thought she would receive some buffs. But nothing happened, except for our protagonist being entranced by the melody. The battle continued, but Tama was unable to hurt the Minotaur. On the contrary, he had already wounded her with his horns. He even declared that he would kill her with his next attack. Nevertheless, before he could act, the sensei interrupted him and asked if he could kill him and the princess first. That caught the Minotaur by surprise. Even the princess didn't see that coming, but he calmly explained that both of them wished to die. The Minotaur laughed and replied he would grant them their wish. He also added that afterward, he would burn the city to the ground, killing every last citizen of that kingdom. The sensei then said that there was no problem with that. After all, since they were about to die, nothing mattered to them. Charlotte began to tremble, but our protagonist ignored it, and the Minotaur launched his attack. Right after, as the princess faced death for real, Charlotte realized she didn't want to die, but to live and protect the people of that kingdom. After hearing her words, our protagonist acknowledged her true desire and told her that he knew she was a kind princess. He then pushed her away while saying that she was not fit to share that moment with him. Unfortunately for the sensei, Annette had finally woken up and created a barrier to block the attack while saying that she wouldn't let him die as long as she was by his side. As a level 18 priestess, her barrier was strong enough to break the Minotaur's horns. Immediately thereafter, Tama delivered the finishing blow with a skill attack and sent the Minotaur through the wall directly to the lake. Afterward, both Annette and Tama thanked each other and buried the hatchet. Right after, the king kneeled before her and apologized for what he had done. Charlotte forgave him, and they both cried together out of happiness. Later, Thomas abdicated the throne, and a 16-year-old Charlotte was crowned queen. As for the trio, Tama and Annette resumed their sacred task of pulling the sensei's coffin while he rested in peace inside. Both women were wondering if Charlotte would be okay, but our protagonist quickly said that they had nothing to worry about because it had been a decision she had made for herself. He then opened the coffin, and while looking at the castle in the distance, he said that although dying women were certainly beautiful, those who stood up on their own 2 feet were beautiful too. Sometime later, on a rainy night, an injured Annette arrived at a church, but when a fellow priestess tried to help her, she managed to ask her to help her companion instead. The other priestess then took a look at the man beside her and clenched her teeth after realizing he was badly wounded. Right after, she asked to get every healing potion they had, and to summon every priest present. A flashback began showing Tama and Annette performing the sacred task of pulling the sensei's coffin, with him inside. Then, they decided to take a break to eat something. Right after, the ultra-mega Chad of this story, well, he didn't show up, and I don't think there is one in the first place. As for our protagonist, he opened the coffin and the priestess offered him some bread. However, he asked her if they had boiled tofu and immediately thereafter closed the coffin. Annette didn't mind being rejected and instead noted the request while saying they would look for some in the next town. Of course, her reaction left Tama completely flabbergasted, and the Catwoman had to admit that the other had an indomitable spirit. Tama then asked Annette if they were close to Grun, the hometown of the Catwoman, and the priestess told her that they should be arriving within a few days. However, she asked her to allow them to make a stop at Zweiten Temple. Tama said she didn't mind, but she yet asked why the other had requested that. Annette then explained that normally, otherworlders arrived at one of 4 temples in their world and departed for the Dark Lord's castle from there. Nevertheless, the goal of our protagonist was not to defeat the Dark Lord, but to find Saken instead, so they should visit the 4 temples to gather information. Of course, that meant that in the worst-case scenario, they might end up having to travel all around the world. Is this foreshadowing? Because I don't think they will find Saken anytime soon. By the way, Annette didn't have any issues if they ended up doing that, but for Tama was another story. The Catwoman even said the priestess was crazy. Well, I wouldn't say she's crazy, but I have to admit she is simping hard. After hearing Tama's remark, Annette replied that she didn't want Sensei to fight the Dark Lord since she didn't want him to put himself in danger. Of course, she was aware that her attitude made her look like a dreadful guide for otherworlders. However, the Catwoman knew better. She was completely sure at that point that the priestess should really love Sensei, and after seeing how vehemently the other denied that once she heard it, only confirmed it. As a form of explanation, the priestess said that Sensei had shown her the light when she had given up hope for her job, so she felt the obligation to help him. Tama immediately asked her what would happen if Saken was his lover, and the bullet hit the mark because the other almost passed out. although she managed to say that she had decided to go with him to verify that. After hearing those words, Tama informed her that she would also go with them, but only until they reached her hometown, which Annette didn't take well. Nevertheless, there was a bigger issue with Annette's plans. Tama wasn't sure that the priestess would be allowed into the temple. After all, she had ditched her previous job to go with them. However, Annette told her that it was okay since the head priest of Zweiten Temple was a dear friend of hers. Moreover, she hadn't left her post without notice. She had sent her familiar to deliver her resignation. Right after, a bat-like creature appeared and began to bite our protagonist's head. He had left the coffin to smoke a cigarette, making him bleed, which startled the priestess. She quickly reprimanded her familiar for always causing mischief, while Tama took care of Sensei's wound. But the worst was yet to come. When Annette asked her familiar if it had delivered her resignation, its response was throwing up the letter in front of her. Of course, that pissed her off, and she hit the creature while asking why it had come back without fulfilling the task. Nevertheless, Sensei found the whole thing amusing, and he even praised the creature for having returned with its master, before giving it a name, Milos, which made him earn the familiar's favor. In the end, our protagonist returned to his coffin, while Annette was overwhelmed by despair because officially, she had left her post without notice. Right after, a giant dragon landed in front of them, terrifying the entire group, familiar included. Annette couldn't understand why the world's most powerful monster had appeared there. Luckily, before it could attack, a young lady, whose face was covered by a hood, told the dragon, whose name was Ruka, to stop. She then got closer to the monster and began caressing its head while talking in a different language. Shortly after, the dragon began to show signs of being pacified, which astonished both women. Annette then asked who she was, but she only replied that there were many monsters in that area and advised them to leave quickly. She then noticed the coffin and thought the group had already suffered casualties, but our protagonist quickly opened it thinking it was time to eat. Annette then tried to explain that he was an eccentric otherworlder, but those words triggered something within the lady because almost immediately she took out her robe, revealing to be a dragon woman. The next thing they saw was the young lady saying she would kill all otherworlders. A fight began, but the young lady very soon proved to be insanely powerful, to the point of making both women unable to move. However, what really surprised the priestess was a mark that appeared in her chest during the battle, because that mark identified the young lady as the wrathful Dark Lord. Immediately thereafter, our protagonist, who wasn't being restrained, walked towards the Dark Lord and told her that he was the only otherworlder there. So if she wanted to kill somebody, it should be him, not his companions. Wow, I have to admit this guy has guts. Yes, I know he did that because he wanted her to kill him. But even though, walking towards a person that powerful and taunting her requires a strong will. Obviously, the Dark Lord wasn't playing, and she immediately pierced his chest with her arm, which shocked Annette and Tama. Afterward, she removed her arm from his body, and he fell on the floor bleeding himself while she walked away saying her name was Waldelia. Nevertheless, against everybody's expectations, mine included, he stood up and told her that he could tell she possessed a powerful hatred. After all, he had once stabbed someone too. Of course, that put her on guard because she didn't understand what was happening. He then walked towards her while saying that at that time he had lost his mind to intense hatred. Right after, he caressed her left cheek with his hand and asked her if that was what was happening to her at that moment. After all, her eyes looked sad. Waldelia was so flabbergasted that her only reaction was to call her dragon and flee while wondering who was our protagonist. By the way, at that moment Sensei had already lost consciousness. Back to the present, Milos had transformed into a magic carpet and had taken them to the temple where the priestess in charge had asked to get every healing potion they had and to summon every priest present. The next day, our protagonist was wandering through the city with Tama. After a while, they found a store and Sensei bought a bottle of poison. But when the seller was telling him how to use it against monsters, our protagonist drank its contents, leaving the cellar and the Catwoman astonished. Okay, I have to admit, this protagonist knows what he wants and doesn't hesitate in trying to achieve it. In front of the store, Annette and her friend, Usha, were drinking some beverages while watching the show. Annette then thanked the other and asked her if she knew an otherworlder named Sakin. Sadly, the other didn't recognize that name. Usha then began reprimanding her friend for having left her post without notice and for traveling with an otherworlder because all of them were indecent people. Annette then began to defend Sensei, and she told her friend that if not for him, she wouldn't be who she was at that moment. Of course, it didn't help her case that she quickly lent him money when he told her he wanted to buy something. Come on, at least ask what he wants to buy, especially since you know he is willing to go to any extent to die. However, Usha was surprised when she learned that our protagonist hadn't received any special power. Especially when Annette told her that he had risked his life against the Dark Lord to protect her and Tama. I would bet that sacrifice would lose its brightness if she also added that his goal is to die. Now, the part that truly surprised Usha was hearing the wrathful Dark Lord had attacked them since he had been destroyed by another otherworlder 7 days before. Somewhere else, in a dark castle, a dragon was being restrained by an otherworlder who mocked him, saying they had already dealt with its master. What that otherworlder didn't know was that Waldelia, who happened to be the daughter of the previous Dark Lord, and her dragon were outside with a strong desire for revenge. Back with the trio, Tama and Annette were discussing the news of the Dark Lord being defeated and wondered who might be the young lady they had battled before. Not to mention, our protagonist had been brought to that world 7 days before, which made no sense if the Dark Lord had already been destroyed. As for Sensei, he was feeling despair because he wanted to write about the things he had experienced since arriving in that world, but was struggling to write, even though he didn't mind crushing Annette's heart by saying he hadn't written anything about her. This guy is diabolic in a very twisted way. The priestess then took them to buy some things, and almost immediately she bought our protagonist a huge and heavy armor. My goodness, that thing looked capable of withstanding the impact of a missile. The armor was so heavy he couldn't even walk, so Tama and Annette left him in the street while they went shopping. Shortly after, Usha found him and informed him that from that moment onwards, Annette would be staying with her because she was very pure, and being with an otherworlder would definitely make her unhappy. She even demanded him to dissolve his party with her. However, he replied that it was for Annette to decide if she wanted to go with him or not, since she was not a bird in a cage. Usha didn't back down and made clear that she didn't trust otherworlders, and as if to confirm her words, at that moment, 2 otherworlders appeared and began to cause problems by announcing the beginning of a new age ruled by the otherworlders. To make things worse, one of them recognized Annette, who had previously punched him. Well, it had been Usha, but Sensei's friend had been with her, and the other one immediately and menacingly walked toward her. Sometime later, the entire town was burning while our protagonist smiled, saying he felt he could finally write his masterpiece. Watch this next video on screen and subscribe to not miss next part.